The heavy aluminum clipboard slammed onto the greasy steel workbench, scattering a row of precision calibration washers. Chad Montgomery, the impeccably dressed but furious terminal director of Vanguard Jet Services, adjusted his silk tie as he stared down at the man in the oil-stained canvas jacket. Garrett Vance did not blink. He slowly wiped his grease-darkened knuckles with a clean cotton rag, his expression as steady and unreadable as stone. Behind Chad, standing near the pristine edge of the private hangar tarmac, was Victoria Sterling, the billionaire CEO of Sterling Global Aerospace. She was the most powerful woman in the aviation industry, a figure feared in boardrooms from London to Tokyo, and she was currently staring at her diamond-encrusted watch with icy impatience. Her 5-year-old son, Leo, clutched her tailored wool coat, looking pale and overwhelmed by the echoing roar of the airfield. Chad pointed a manicured finger directly at Garrett's chest. "Your archaic inspection routines are completely destroying my operational metrics, Vance. This is a private luxury terminal, not a government shipyard." Madam Sterling's flight was scheduled for departure 12 minutes ago, and you are still pulling apart a secondary intake housing that my digital diagnostic scanners already cleared. Your stubborn refusal to streamline your workflow tells me everything I need to know. You are done here. Effective immediately, your contract is terminated. Garrett looked past the red-faced director, his calm, deep-set eyes briefly locking with Victoria Sterling's cold, aristocratic gaze. She didn't look away, nor did she offer a single word of intervention. To her, Garrett was simply an anonymous, low-level line mechanic blocking her path to a critical defense tech summit in Washington. She viewed the world through the lens of absolute efficiency, and right now, this quiet mechanic was an inefficiency. Garrett did not argue. He did not plead for his job, nor did he raise his voice. He had spent the last 5 years living a life of deliberate obscurity, hiding a brilliant past behind a wall of humble, meticulous labor. His only priority in this world was his 6-year-old daughter, Lily, who was currently sitting quietly in the employee break room, coloring a picture of a starship. "I gave you a formal warning about the pressure differential sequence in that turbine housing, Montgomery," Garrett said, his voice a low, resonant baritone that carried a weight of absolute certainty. "The digital scanners don't account for microfractures in high-altitude atmospheric shifts. If you clear this airframe for takeoff without a manual bypass check, you are gambling with lives." Chad let out a mocking, theatrical laugh, making sure Victoria could hear his unwavering confidence. "I think the engineering team at Sterling Global knows a bit more about aviation safety than a high school-educated mechanic who can't even pass the modern digital system certification. Pack your tools, Vance. Security will escort you and your kid off the property in 10 minutes. Garrett nodded once, a gesture of quiet, unbreakable dignity. He walked past the smirking director without another word. In the corner of the hangar, he opened his battered metal locker. He didn't care about the tools. They belonged to the facility. The only item he took was a crinkled, colorful drawing taped to the inside of the door. It was a picture of a tall man holding a little girl's hand with the words "Best Dad in the Universe" written in sloppy purple crayon. He folded it carefully, sliding it into the breast pocket of his jacket, right over his heart. Moments later, Garrett walked into the break room. Lily looked up, her bright blue eyes lighting up as she dropped her crayons. "Daddy, are we going to the park now?" Garrett smiled, the hard, defensive lines of his face instantly melting into a look of profound warmth and tenderness. He swept her up into his powerful arms, holding her close against his chest. "Yes, sweetie. We're going to the park. Daddy's all done here." As Garrett carried Lily through the side exit toward his battered 20-year-old Ford pickup truck, the atmosphere across the Vanguard Prime Terminal suddenly fractured. The peaceful afternoon sky over Austin, Texas, was violently shattered by a deep, rhythmic thrumming that vibrated through the concrete foundations of the hangar. It wasn't the sound of a commercial airliner or a luxury business jet. It was a terrifying militaristic roar that grew louder by the second, causing the glass windows of the executive lounge to rattle violently. Victoria Sterling froze on the boarding stairs of her private jet. Her son Leo began to cry, burying his face in her side as the wind from the sky whipped her hair across her face. Chad Montgomery ran out onto the tarmac, shielding his eyes as he looked up. Dropping rapidly through the low clouds were two massive, unmarked, experimental stealth transport helicopters. They were cutting-edge military assets, finished in matte black, radar-absorbent coating, their multi-blade rotors tearing the air into a deafening frenzy. They didn't signal the control tower. They didn't ask for permission. They descended with absolute, terrifying authority, landing squarely on the private tarmac, completely blocking Victoria Sterling's multi-million-dollar jet and sealing the main exit gates of the facility. The sheer force of their downward thrust blew Chad's expensive clipboard across the asphalt, leaving the entire facility in a state of paralyzed shock. The matte black rotors slowed to a heavy, chest-vibrating idle, casting a massive shadow across the pristine concrete of the private terminal. The pressurized side doors of the lead transport hissed open, and 6 elite operators in advanced tactical gear with no identifying insignias stepped out. They formed a flawless defensive perimeter, their weapons held at low ready. Following them was a tall, imposing man in a crisp naval uniform, his chest adorned with high-level commendations. Captain Maxwell Granger stepped onto the tarmac, his sharp eyes instantly scanning the facility with absolute, unyielding focus. Chad Montgomery, desperately trying to salvage his dignity and reassert his corporate domain, straightened his jacket and hurried toward the military officer. This is a restricted, privately leased facility under Vanguard Jet Services. Chad barked, his voice straining to carry over the hum of the idling turbines. You cannot just land unauthorized military aircraft on my tarmac and block my priority clients. I demand to know who is in charge here. Captain Granger didn't even turn his head. He continued walking forward, stepping right past the sputtering terminal director as if he were a ghost. The 2 armed operators flanking the captain subtly shifted their weight, their silent, lethal presence causing Chad to instantly freeze, his face turning a stark, pale white. Victoria Sterling stepped down from the boarding stairs of her private jet, her heels clicking sharply against the asphalt. She wrapped her tailored coat tighter around herself, her aristocratic composure masking a sudden, deep spike of adrenaline. "Commander," she said, her voice carrying the cold, intimidating authority that had crushed dozens of competitors in corporate boardrooms. "I am Victoria Sterling, Chief Executive of Sterling Global Aerospace. My aircraft is cleared for an immediate Department of Defense Tech Summit in Washington. Whatever exercise you are conducting, you are actively disrupting a multi-billion-dollar national security pipeline. I suggest you clear my runway immediately." Captain Granger stopped, turning his gaze toward the powerful woman. "Madam Sterling, your corporate clearance is currently secondary to a Tier 1 operational emergency," Granger replied, his voice a flat, iron wall. "By executive order, this entire airspace is under temporary military lockdown. No one leaves this ground." At that moment, the fragile emotional boundary of the scene completely fractured. 5-year-old Leo, already overwhelmed by the deafening roar of the helicopters and the sudden appearance of heavily armed soldiers, collapsed into a state of total frantic panic. He began to hyperventilate, his small hands clawing at his mother's coat as he let out a piercing, terrified scream. Victoria's flawless boardroom armor shattered instantly. Faced with her son's raw, uncontrollable terror, the powerful billionaire became completely helpless. She knelt down, her hands trembling violently as she grabbed his shoulders, her voice rising in a sharp, anxious panic. "Leo. Leo, stop it right now! Look at me! You are perfectly fine. Do you hear me? Stop crying." But her rigid, frantic energy only amplified the little boy's fear. He pulled away from her, burying his face in his hands, his chest heaving as he choked on his own tears. Victoria looked around the tarmac, her eyes wide with a rare, terrifying vulnerability. She had billions of dollars in her bank account, thousands of employees at her command, and the ear of the Pentagon, yet in this single, raw moment, she had absolutely no idea how to give her own child peace. 30 yards away, near the rusty tailgate of his old pickup truck, Garrett Vance stopped. He was holding his daughter, Lily, securely against his hip. Unlike Leo, Lily was completely quiet. She had her small arms wrapped loosely around Garrett's neck, her face resting peacefully against his shoulder. Even with the massive stealth helicopters idling nearby, she didn't show a single ounce of fear. She knew that as long as her father was holding her, nothing in the universe could ever hurt her. Garrett heard the little boy's desperate cries. He looked across the tarmac, seeing Victoria's trembling hands and the pure, helpless panic in her eyes. His quiet masculinity and protective instinct overrode everything else. He didn't see a billionaire CEO who had just allowed him to be fired. He saw a mother failing to save her drowning child. Garrett gently set Lily down onto the bench seat of his truck. "Stay right here for a second, sweetie. Daddy will be right back," he whispered, his voice incredibly soft and grounding. Lily nodded smoothly. "Okay, Daddy." Garrett turned and walked back onto the tarmac, his heavy work boots striking the concrete with a slow, deliberate rhythm. The moment he crossed the security line, two tactical operators instantly pivoted, raising their rifles and locking their sights directly onto his chest. "Vance!" Chad Montgomery screamed, finding his voice from behind the safety of a luggage cart. "What are you doing? Get away from them! Security! Arrest this lunatic before he gets us all killed!" Garrett didn't stop. He didn't look at the rifles pointed at his chest, nor did he acknowledge Chad's frantic shouting. His posture remained completely relaxed, carrying a steady, immovable mass of confidence that seemed to radiate through the tense air. He locked his eyes onto the sobbing little boy and spoke, his deep, resonant baritone cutting through the residual noise of the tarmac like a warm blanket. "Hey there, buddy," Garrett said softly, ignoring the soldiers as he walked right past the perimeter guards. The operators didn't fire. They froze, their eyes widening behind their ballistic visors as they looked at Garrett's face. Garrett knelt down on the hard concrete just 3 feet away from the panicking child. He didn't reach out aggressively. He simply placed his large, grease-stained hands flat on his own knees, lowering his center of gravity to match the boy's. "Those big black choppers are just giant fans, buddy. They're just blowing away the hot air so we can have a cool afternoon. Look at me. Take a big, deep breath. Just like this." Garrett took a slow, deep, exaggerated breath. Leo's sobbing suddenly hitched. He slowly pulled his hands away from his tear-streaked face, his wide, frightened eyes locking onto Garrett's calm, steady gaze. There was something about the absolute tranquility in Garrett's voice, an undeniable emotional security that acted like a physical anchor. Leo mirrored the breath, his small chest expanding as he let out a shaky sigh. "That's it," Garrett whispered, a warm, genuine smile breaking through his rugged features. "Just count to 3 with me. 1, 2, 3. You're entirely safe. I promise." Within seconds, Leo's hyperventilation stopped completely. He took a final, trembling breath and stepped away from his mother, instinctively moving closer to Garrett, his small hand reaching out to touch the fabric of Garrett's oil-stained sleeve. Victoria Sterling stood up slowly, her hands still shaking, her heart hammering against her ribs. She stared down at the humble mechanic in utter, paralyzed shock. She had spent his entire shift treating him like an invisible, disposable piece of labor, yet he had just accomplished in 30 seconds what she couldn't buy with all her wealth. Captain Granger walked over, the heavy soles of his boots stopping right beside Garrett. The military commander didn't look at Victoria, and he didn't look at the stunned terminal director. He stood perfectly rigid, his eyes locked onto the kneeling mechanic. With a look of profound, unconditional reverence, Captain Granger brought his right hand up to his brow, executing a flawless, razor-sharp military salute. "Chief Petty Officer Vance," Granger said, his voice ringing across the silent tarmac with absolute gravity. "We have an advanced tactical avionics failure on the flagship carrier offshore. The digital systems have completely choked, and the entire fleet protocol is locked down. The Joint Chiefs sent us. We need the Ghost Protocol, sir. We need you." The silence that followed Captain Granger's words was heavy, suffocating, and absolute. The only sound remaining on the tarmac was the low, rhythmic throb of the twin stealth helicopters. Chad Montgomery looked as if the ground had just dissolved beneath his designer shoes. His face flushed a deep, panicked crimson, his eyes darting frantically from the rigidly saluting naval captain to the quiet man standing in the oil-stained canvas jacket. "Chief Petty Officer?" Chad stammered, his voice cracking as he took a tentative step forward. "Captain, there has to be a massive administrative error here. This man is Garrett Vance. He's a low-level, uncertified line mechanic. I literally just terminated his contract 10 minutes ago for insubordination and failing to meet our basic digital diagnostic speeds. He's a liability to this terminal." Captain Granger slowly lowered his salute, turning a gaze of pure, icy contempt toward the terminal director. The temperature on the tarmac seemed to drop 10 degrees. "Your digital diagnostic tools exist because this man allowed them to, Montgomery," Granger said, his voice cutting through the humid Texas air like a razor blade. 10 years ago, Garrett Vance was the principal systems architect for the Navy's tactical atmospheric defense grid. He didn't just pass your certifications, he wrote the foundational frameworks for them. If he told you a system was failing, you should have grounded the entire fleet, let alone a commercial executive transport. Victoria Sterling felt a cold chill strike her spine. She stepped backward, her eyes locked onto Garrett. The arrogant, dismissive attitude she had held just moments prior evaporated into ash. She was a woman who prided herself on reading people, on identifying assets and liabilities within a millisecond of entering a room. Yet, she had completely misjudged the quiet man standing before her. She had looked at his grease-covered hands and assumed weakness, assumed a lack of ambition. In reality, he possessed a level of authority that her billions could never buy. Garrett remained entirely calm. He didn't look at Chad with a sense of petty triumph, nor did he boast. He slowly stood up to his full height, his physical presence easily matching the stature of the elite military operators surrounding him. "I left that life behind, Captain," Garrett said softly, his voice steady and resolute. "My active commission ended 5 years ago. I am a civilian now, and my only priority is my daughter. I don't do fleet overrides anymore." As if on cue, the passenger door of the old Ford pickup truck clicked open. Lily stepped down onto the concrete tarmac, holding her purple crayon tightly. She didn't look at the armed soldiers or the massive black helicopters with fear. She only looked at her father. "Daddy?" she called out, her sweet, clear voice cutting through the masculine tension of the military perimeter. "Are those your friends?" The entire atmosphere shifted. The 6 heavily armed tactical operators, men trained for the most brutal combat scenarios on Earth, instinctively shifted their stances, lowering their weapons entirely. Captain Granger's stern expression softened into one of profound respect as he looked at the little girl. Garrett turned instantly, the rigid, unyielding posture of a legendary military specialist instantly dissolving into the warmth of a protective father. He walked over to Lily, kneeling down on the asphalt to look her in the eye. He gently zipped up her faded denim jacket against the wind whipped up by the helicopter rotors. "They're just here to ask Daddy a question, sweetie," Garrett whispered, brushing a stray lock of hair from her forehead. "Just stay close to the truck, okay? I'll be right there." Lily smiled innocently, nodding her head. "Okay, Daddy." Victoria Sterling watched this interaction, her heart aching with a sudden, overwhelming wave of emotion. She looked at her own son, Leo, who had completely stopped crying. The little boy was standing quietly by Garrett's side, staring up at the mechanic with a look of pure, unconditional trust. Victoria realized, with a sting of bitter reality, that for all her power, wealth, and international influence, she had never been able to provide her son with that kind of absolute emotional security. Her world was built on contracts and leverage. Garrett's world was built on an unshakable, quiet strength. Before Captain Granger could speak again, a sudden, sharp electronic whine erupted from the boarding stairs of Victoria's private jet. The primary cockpit displays flickered violently, casting an eerie green glow through the cabin windows. A harsh, automated audio warning began to blare from the aircraft's external speakers, followed by a thick, acrid plume of gray smoke billowing directly out of the secondary intake housing, the exact component Garrett had spent his shift inspecting. Chad Montgomery let out a terrified gasp, stumbling backward as the luxury aircraft's internal systems began to violently shudder. The very disaster Garrett had predicted was unfolding right in front of their eyes, and Victoria's son had been scheduled to be on that plane. "Turn off the master breakers!" Chad screamed at his remaining crew, who were freezing in absolute panic. Garrett didn't yell. He didn't run. He slowly stood up from his daughter's side, his eyes locking onto the smoking engine housing with a cold, analytical focus that signaled the return of a legend. The acrid chemical smoke billowing from the executive jet's wing root rapidly transformed from a pale gray haze into a thick, choking black cloud. The aircraft's automated external alarms shifted from a rhythmic warning into a continuous, high-pitched shriek that pierced the ears of everyone on the tarmac. "Disconnect the ground power unit," Chad Montgomery screamed, his voice reaching a panicked, undignified register. He grabbed a nearby line handler by the safety vest, shaking him violently. "Shut it down!" "Why isn't the onboard fire suppression system deploying?" "Use the digital override console." The line technician's hands shook so hard he dropped his ruggedized tablet onto the asphalt, the screen shattering. "It's not responding, Mr. Montgomery. The main avionics bus is pulling an infinite feedback loop. The digital system thinks the engine is totally dark, but the internal temperature sensors are redlining. It's locking us out of the fuel emergency valves." The hangar crew completely dissolved into chaos, scattering away from the multi-million-dollar airframe as the distinct, terrifying sound of boiling hydraulic fluid hissed through the vents. Victoria Sterling stood paralyzed on the tarmac. Her brilliant corporate mind, capable of recalculating complex international trade logistics in a heartbeat, was entirely useless against the raw, violent reality of a mechanical thermal runaway. She looked at her burning aircraft, then down at her son, Leo, who was screaming, his small hands pressed tightly over his ears to block out the agonizing wail of the sirens. She realized, with a sickening jolt of absolute terror, that if Garrett Vance hadn't delayed her flight, she and her child would have been at 10,000 feet when this system suffocated itself. They would have been entirely helpless. Captain Granger turned his gaze to Chad, his jaw clenched with military severity. Your digital diagnostics cleared a ruptured pressure seal, Montgomery. You almost put a civilian asset and a national defense partner into the air with a ticking bomb. I followed the standard software protocols. Chad stammered, backing away as a stray spark shot out from the jet's intake, cracking like a whip against the concrete. The software said the airframe was pristine. Software doesn't feel the heat expansion in a legacy metal housing, Garrett's voice boomed, completely slicing through the panic. He didn't run, nor did he show a single flicker of fear. He walked with a steady, calculated urgency toward the burning aircraft. He didn't look at Chad, who was trembling by the luggage carts, completely exposed as an incompetent fraud before the highest military authority in the region. Garrett bypassed the frantic ground crew, walking straight to the rear utility bay located beneath the jet's fuselage. "Vance, don't!" Chad yelled weakly. "The system is entirely deadlocked. You'll trigger a complete electrical explosion if you touch the manual bus without the master digital key." Garrett ignored him entirely. He reached into his jacket pocket, pulling out a heavy, specialized mechanical wrench he had kept from his old Navy days. He didn't need a digital key. He knew the physical architecture of the vessel better than the engineers who built it. Before he stepped under the smoking wing, he looked back at the perimeter. The heavy black smoke was beginning to drift across the tarmac, catching the wind from the idling stealth helicopters. Leo was coughing, his small chest heaving as Victoria tried to shield him with her wool coat, her eyes filled with a desperate, unspoken plea for help. "Lily," Garrett called out, his voice instantly dropping its commanding steel and returning to the soft, protective tone of a father. Lily leaned out of the truck cab, her face completely calm. "Yes, Daddy? Take Leo into the truck with you. Close the door and turn on the air vents," Garrett instructed smoothly. Lily didn't hesitate. She stepped down from the truck, walked right past the heavily armed tactical operators who stood like statues, and reached out her small hand toward the billionaire's son. "Come on, Leo," she said with absolute sweetness. "My daddy is fixing the big fan. We can watch from the truck where it's quiet." Leo looked up at his mother, then at Lily's outstretched hand. Without a single moment of reservation, the terrified little boy let go of his mother's expensive coat and grasped Lily's hand. He let the little girl lead him away from the screaming alarms and the billowing smoke, climbing up into the worn, safe fabric seats of Garrett's old pickup truck. Victoria watched them go, her breath catching in her throat. She was left standing entirely alone on the concrete, stripped of her corporate armor, forced to rely entirely on the man she had looked down upon. Garrett turned back to the aircraft. With two powerful, precise strokes of his wrench, he sheared off the external security padlock of the auxiliary manual override panel, a backup system Chad didn't even know existed because it wasn't listed on his digital tablet screens. Garrett reached deep into the dark, hot recess of the mechanical bay, his bare forearm brushing against the burning metal framework without a single flinch. He found the secondary hydraulic pressure relief valve by pure touch, relying on the muscle memory of a man who had kept fighter jets operational on pitch-black carrier decks in the middle of storms. He threw his weight into the manual lever. A loud, deep metallic clunk echoed through the airframe. Instantly, the high-pitched shriek of the alarms died. The thick black smoke stopped billowing from the intake, replaced a second later by a massive, pressurized cloud of white halon gas that flooded the turbine housing, smothering the thermal runaway in a matter of seconds. The dangerous hum of the boiling fluids faded into a harmless hiss, and the aircraft went completely, utterly dark. The tarmac fell into a stunned, breathless silence. The ground crew stared in absolute awe at the lone mechanic standing under the smoking wing, his canvas jacket lightly dusted with white fire suppression powder. Garrett slowly pulled his arm out of the utility bay, his face completely expressionless as he wiped a fresh streak of black grease from his palm. He looked down into the panel one last time to ensure the emergency shutdown was permanent, but as his eyes scanned the internal mechanical console, he froze. Deep within the manual override housing, completely bypassed by the commercial software, a small, secondary electronic module was blinking with a steady, rhythmic crimson pulse. It wasn't a standard manufacturer component. It was a highly encrypted military-grade data override unit, completely foreign to civilian aviation. Captain Granger walked up behind him, his boots clicking heavily against the damp asphalt, his eyes narrowing as he saw the red light reflecting off Garrett's hard jawline. "Chief Petty Officer," Granger whispered, his voice dangerously low. "That's not a system failure." Garrett looked at the encrypted module, his quiet masculinity hardening into an icy, protective fury. "No, Captain," Garrett replied, his voice vibrating with an ominous weight. This was a remote, tactical lockdown sequence. Someone didn't want this plane to leave the ground. Captain Granger reached for his secure tactical radio, his face tightening into lines of grim urgency. "Alpha Team, expand the perimeter to a 2-mile radius. Nobody enters or leaves this facility. Secure the server room immediately." Victoria Sterling stepped closer, her heels clicking tentatively against the foam-dusted asphalt. The smell of burnt insulation and halon gas hung heavy in the air. "What do you mean, a tactical lockdown? Who would have access to install military-grade components on my personal transport?" "Someone with high-level clearance inside your own supply chain, Madam Sterling," Captain Granger replied, his voice flat and unyielding. He turned his attention back to Garrett, who was already tracing the hidden wiring with a steady, calloused finger. "Chief, is that the Spectre 7 encryption array?" Garrett didn't look up. His eyes were fixed on the rhythmic crimson pulse of the module. "It's a variant of it. It's a phantom override protocol designed to mimic a localized thermal failure. If they had taken off, the engine would have choked over the Gulf, and the black box would have pointed to a standard maintenance oversight." He looked directly at Chad Montgomery, his gaze piercing through the director's remaining composure. An oversight caused by skipping manual safety checks in favor of faster metrics. Chad's breath hitched. He staggered back, his face completely drained of color as the realization of what he had almost facilitated struck him like a physical blow. I didn't know. The digital diagnostic logs were verified by our corporate office. I was just trying to keep the terminal running on schedule." "Your schedule almost cost 2 civilian lives to cover up a targeted assassination," Granger growled, stepping into Chad's personal space. 2 heavily armed operators instantly stepped forward, their shadows eclipsing the trembling director. "You are officially being detained under federal emergency protocols for questioning. Take him away." Chad didn't even fight. He let out a weak, pathetic sob as the operators gripped his arms and led him away from the tarmac, his expensive leather shoes dragging against the concrete where he had so proudly stood just an hour ago. Victoria watched the director get marched off, but her focus quickly drifted back to the old pickup truck parked near the hangar gates. Through the dusty glass of the windshield, she could see her son, Leo. He wasn't crying anymore. Lily was showing him her coloring book, pointing at a drawing of a starship, and Leo actually had a tiny, hesitant smile on his face. The powerful billionaire felt a heavy sob catch in her throat. She covered her mouth with a trembling hand, her shoulders shaking slightly as the immense pressure of her life finally broke through her porcelain armor. She had built an empire worth billions. She had negotiated defense contracts with world leaders, yet she had been entirely blind to the viper nesting inside her own company. Her money couldn't protect her son from a hidden wire. It couldn't soothe his panic. Garrett stepped out from under the wing of the disabled jet. He walked over to Victoria, his presence imposing yet remarkably grounding. He didn't offer a hollow corporate apology, nor did he treat her with the distant deference she was used to. He stood by her side like a solid, immovable wall. "He's safe, Victoria," Garrett said softly, using her first name for the first time. His voice carried a deep, soothing resonance that instantly began to calm her racing heart. "My daughter knows how to handle a storm. She'll keep him distracted." Victoria lowered her hand, looking up into Garrett's calm, weathered face. Her eyes were bright with unshed tears. "I spent the last year pushing everyone to their absolute limits. I fired people who told me to slow down. I thought efficiency was the only way to keep us safe, to keep the company ahead of the threats. And I almost put my son on a plane that was rigged to fall out of the sky." She shook her head, a rare, vulnerable fragility breaking through her voice. "I have everything, Garrett. I have all the power in the world. But right now, I feel like I have absolutely nothing. Power buys control, not safety," Garrett replied quietly, his eyes reflecting a deep, hidden history of his own personal losses. "You can't engineer purity of mind, Victoria. It's built on the things you refuse to rush." Before Victoria could respond, the crimson light on the hidden military module beneath the jet suddenly stopped blinking. It turned a solid, burning blue. A sharp, synthesized tone beeped twice from the aircraft's internal fuse box. Garrett's posture instantly shifted, his muscles tightening as his quiet masculinity transformed back into a lethal, analytical focus. Granger, the module just pinged an external network. It wasn't a static timer. Captain Granger's radio suddenly erupted with frantic static. "Captain, this is terminal security. The main power grid for the entire Austin perimeter just dropped. The backup generators are being systematically bypassed by a remote signal. The automated security gates are locking down. We're trapped inside the hangar area." A split second later, the massive overhead floodlights of the Vanguard terminal flickered and died, plunging the entire hangar into a dim, shadow-filled twilight. The electronic security gates groaned as their heavy steel locks slammed shut automatically, sealing the tarmac off from the main road. But the true shock came from Garrett's old pickup truck. The truck's headlights suddenly flashed on by themselves, and the digital dashboard began to glow with the exact same solid, burning blue light as the sabotage module on the jet. Victoria let out a sharp, choked gasp, her maternal instincts violently overriding her physical exhaustion. "Leo!" she screamed, sprinting toward the old Ford pickup truck. She threw her weight against the passenger side door handle, but it refused to budge. The automated lockdown had engaged the truck's vacuum-sealed locking pins. Inside the cab, Leo's eyes went wide as he looked at the glowing blue dashboard, his small fingers gripping Lily's hand tightly. Lily remained perfectly still, her eyes locked onto her father through the glass. Captain Granger spun around, his hand instinctively dropping to his service weapon. "Tech team, break that window. Get the children out now." Two tactical operators rushed forward, raising heavy breaching tools. "Stand down!" Garrett's voice sliced through the darkness like an iron shutter. It wasn't a shout. It was a command born of absolute, unquestioned battlefield authority. The operators stopped mid-stride, their boots skidding on the concrete, their training forcing them to obey the pure command in his tone. Garrett walked past Victoria, his stride steady, his face illuminated by the eerie blue glare cutting through the windshield. "It's not a hostile hack on the vehicle," Garrett said, his voice flat and perfectly controlled. "It's an authentication handshake. The network is looking for me." Victoria stared at him, her hands trembling against the truck's window frame. "What are you talking about? It's a 20-year-old truck, Garrett. How is it connecting to a military-grade encryption array?" "Because I didn't just build the software for the Navy, Victoria," Garrett murmured, stepping up to the driver's side door. "I built the hardware modules that carry it." He didn't reach for a key. Instead, Garrett pressed his thumb firmly against a small, seemingly rusted bolt head near the base of the side mirror housing. There was a faint, high-frequency hiss, followed by a reassuring mechanical click as the heavy door unlatched. Garrett swung the door open, the interior dome light casting a warm amber glow over the two children. Lily looked up, completely unfazed. "Daddy, the old dashboard is making that funny singing noise again. The one from when we lived near the base." "I know, sweetie. Daddy's gonna turn it off," Garrett said, his voice softening into that incredible protective warmth. He reached beneath the worn, torn fabric of the bench seat, pulling a concealed release lever. With a smooth, hydraulic glide, a section of the floorboards retracted, revealing a pristine, shock-proof, military-spec titanium console hidden beneath the rusted body of the truck. Captain Granger walked over, his eyes widening in absolute stunned disbelief as he looked at the glowing interface. "My God, you kept the Sovereign terminal. The Pentagon protocol log said the prototype was destroyed when you resigned." "It was retired, Granger. Just like me," Garrett replied calmly. His large, calloused fingers began to move across the ruggedized keyboard with a speed and precision that defied his rugged mechanic appearance. He wasn't looking at commercial lines of code, he was typing in raw, algorithmic commands. With every keystroke, the blue light on the dashboard fractured, replaced by a deep, secure, amber hue. Victoria stood by the open door, watching him. The man she had dismissed as an uneducated line mechanic, the man Chad Montgomery had humiliated for being too slow, was currently operating a Tier 1 military command terminal built into the frame of a rusted truck. The sheer power contrast was staggering. She had hundreds of engineers in white lab coats at her corporate headquarters who couldn't even access this level of federal infrastructure, and Garrett was controlling it from a grease-stained seat. "He's tracing the remote signal," Captain Granger whispered to Victoria, his voice filled with a rare sense of awe. "He's bypassing the entire regional blackout." "The attackers think they locked us in," Garrett said, his eyes reflecting the rapid lines of scrolling green text on the monitor. "They used the Vanguard terminal's local servers to trigger the facility lockdown. They wanted to isolate the aircraft so they could retrieve the sabotage module before the military arrived. But they forgot one thing." "What?" Victoria asked, her voice a breathless whisper. "I designed the architecture for the Vanguard mainframe 15 years ago," Garrett said, a cold, dangerous smile touching his lips. "They're trying to lock a house using keys I forged." With a final, definitive strike of the Enter key, Garrett slammed his palm onto the console's master breaker. A massive, violent surge of electricity rippled through the terminal. The heavy steel security gates of the facility suddenly groaned, their massive gears turning as they were forcefully commanded to open. The overhead floodlights flickered once, twice, and then roared back to life, bathing the entire hangar in a blinding white light. Across the tarmac, the communication radios of the tactical team erupted with clear, unjammed audio. "Captain, the network is back up. The remote override has been entirely severed. We've isolated the source of the broadcast. It's coming from an unmarked executive suite less than 3 miles away, on the top floor of the Meridian Luxury Hotel." Garrett slowly stood up from the truck cab, shutting the hidden floor compartment with a heavy click. He looked at Captain Granger, his quiet masculinity radiating an icy, lethal intensity. "They're still in the area, Granger. They don't know they've been traced yet." Victoria took a step toward him, her aristocratic composure completely replaced by a deep, emotional reverence. "Garrett, how did you do that? Who are you really?" Garrett didn't answer her. He reached into the cab, gently patting Leo on the head before looking at Lily. "Keep him safe, sweetie. Daddy has to go fix one more thing." He turned back to Captain Granger, his voice dropping into a low, commanding growl that made the elite soldiers instantly stand at attention. "Get the transport ready, Captain. We're going to the Meridian." But before Garrett could take a step toward the black stealth helicopters, the main security gates at the edge of the tarmac violently shattered. A heavy, armored luxury SUV slammed through the steel barriers, its tires screaming against the concrete as it spun out, heading directly toward Garrett's truck at lethal speed. The screaming whine of the SUV's supercharged engine echoed violently off the hangar walls. The vehicle was a multi-ton ballistic weapon heading directly for the fragile cab of the old Ford pickup truck where the 2 children were trapped. Garrett Vance did not hesitate for a fraction of a second. His protective instincts exploded into absolute, calculated action. With a single, powerful sweep of his arm, he slammed the heavy driver's side door of his truck shut, ensuring the vacuum locks engaged, and sealing Lily and Leo inside the reinforced steel cabin. Instead of diving for cover, Garrett stepped directly into the path of the oncoming vehicle, positioning his broad, muscular frame as a human shield between the lethal threat and his daughter. "Open fire!" Captain Granger roared. The 6 elite tactical operators reacted with the terrifying, synchronized speed of Tier 1 warriors. Their weapons erupted in a deafening, rhythmic volley of precision gunfire. Heavy, armor-piercing rounds systematically shattered the SUV's windshield and ripped through the reinforced front grille, instantly obliterating the engine block in a shower of sparks and black fluid. The front tires blew apart under the relentless impact, causing the massive luxury vehicle to violently lose traction. The SUV skidded sideways across the foam-dusted tarmac, sparks spraying wildly into the air as the metal rims scraped the concrete, before it slammed heavily into a massive row of industrial steel cargo containers, just 10 feet shy of Garrett's truck. The echoing thunder of the gunfire died away, replaced by the hissing steam of the ruined SUV and the heavy, ragged breathing of the people on the tarmac. Garrett stood completely motionless, his boots planted firmly on the ground, his face a mask of cold, unyielding iron. He didn't check his own body for injuries. He didn't tremble. He simply turned around, checking the glass of his pickup truck. Inside, Lily was holding Leo tightly, her small hands covering the boy's eyes just as her father had taught her to do during a crisis. Seeing his daughter nod safely through the window, the rigid tension in Garrett's shoulders subtly eased. The tactical operators swarmed the wrecked SUV, tearing open the twisted driver's side door. They dragged a man out onto the concrete, pinning him down with absolute force. He was dressed in a bespoke Italian suit, now torn and covered in dust, but his face was instantly recognizable. Julian Cole, Victoria Sterling's Senior Vice President of Global Supply Chains. Victoria felt the final remnants of her corporate reality shatter. She stumbled forward, her eyes wide with a mixture of raw horror and burning betrayal. "Julian," she whispered, her voice cracking with emotion. You were the one who authorized the maintenance digital logs. You rigged my aircraft." Julian Cole spit a mouthful of blood onto the concrete, looking up at her with a venomous, defeated sneer. "You were going to hand over the entire atmospheric defense framework to the Pentagon, Victoria." He coughed, his voice strained as the operators tightened the zip ties on his wrists. "Do you know what foreign buyers would pay for that data? Millions. But you were too righteous. You wouldn't sell. So I had to ensure your flight never reached Washington. It was supposed to look like a tragic mechanical failure. A failure caused by a lazy, uncertified terminal crew." He looked past her, his gaze locking onto Garrett with pure hatred. "But this damn ghost. This piece of trash mechanic wouldn't let the plane take off. He kept checking the manual housing. He ruined everything." "Take him to the transport," Captain Granger commanded, his voice cold enough to freeze water. The operators dragged Julian Cole away, leaving his expensive shoes scraping pathetic marks across the asphalt. Victoria stood in the center of the tarmac, completely paralyzed. The wealth, the boardrooms, the global trade metrics, it had all been a beautiful lie concealing a lethal trap. She slowly turned toward Garrett's old pickup truck, her knees buckling beneath her. For the first time in her adult life, the powerful, intimidating billionaire executive completely broke. She fell to her knees on the cold, hard concrete, burying her face in her hands as silent, violent tears finally racked her entire body. She had almost lost her son to a man she smiled at every single day in the office. Garrett watched her for a silent moment. He didn't look down on her vulnerability, nor did he walk away. He walked over with slow, grounding steps, kneeling down right beside her on the dirty asphalt, completely ignoring the grease that stained his trousers. He didn't touch her aggressively. He simply placed his large, warm hand a few inches away from hers, offering an immovable anchor of presence. "The storm is past, Victoria," Garrett said, his deep baritone incredibly soft, vibrating with a profound, comforting empathy. "The children are safe, you are safe, the wires are cut." Victoria slowly raised her head, her face tear-stained, her flawless composure completely gone. She looked at Garrett's calloused, grease-darkened hands, the very hands she had deemed disposable just an hour ago. She realized that while her billions had surrounded her with wolves in tailored suits, this humble single father had given her absolute, unconditional safety without asking for a single thing in return. "How do you do it?" she whispered, her voice trembling violently as she looked into his steady eyes. "How do you stay so calm when the entire world is burning around you?" "Because I know exactly what matters," Garrett said quietly, his gaze drifting toward the truck where Lily was gently wiping a tear from Leo's cheek. "When you lose everything else, you realize that peace isn't something you buy from a catalog. It's what you protect with your bare hands." Victoria reached out, her trembling fingers lightly brushing the rough fabric of Garrett's sleeve, seeking the comfort of his quiet strength. The emotional chemistry between them hung thick in the air, a silent, powerful realization that money could buy an empire, but it could never buy the profound security of a true man's protection. Captain Granger walked up, stepping into the space with a quiet reverence. "Chief Petty Officer Vance, the perimeter is entirely secure, and the Joint Chiefs are waiting for the confirmation code from the Sovereign Terminal. The fleet is still locked down until you authorize the master bypass. We need to transport you to the flagship immediately." Garrett stood up slowly, offering his hand to Victoria. She took it, allowing his immense strength to lift her effortlessly back to her feet. She didn't look like a cold CEO anymore. She looked like a woman who had finally found a safe harbor. "I'm going with you," Victoria said, her voice regaining a sudden, fierce determination as she looked at Garrett. "My company built the components they compromised. I will dismantle my own board of directors piece by piece to fix this, Garrett. But I won't let you or your daughter out of my sight." Garrett looked at her, seeing the rare, genuine fire in her eyes, and for the first time all afternoon, a genuine smile touched his lips. "Pack your things, Captain," Garrett said to Granger, his voice returning to that commanding, legendary steel. "We have a fleet to wake up." The twin stealth transport helicopters tore through the evening sky, their massive frames banking sharply over the gleaming coastline toward the Naval Tactical Command Center. Inside the pressurized cabin, the chaotic noise of the world seemed to fade into a profound, reverent stillness. Garrett Vance sat perfectly upright, his powerful arm wrapped securely around his daughter. Lily had finally succumbed to exhaustion, her head resting peacefully against his chest, her small fingers still clutching her purple crayon. Sitting directly across from them was Leo, who had refused to leave Garrett's side. The little boy was fast asleep, his small hands wrapped around Garrett's old mechanical wrench as if it were a shield against the dark. Victoria Sterling watched them from the adjacent leather seat. The harsh, fluorescent tactical lights of the cabin caught the tear tracks on her cheeks, but her eyes were no longer filled with despair. They were fixed on the humble man who had completely upended her universe. For years, she believed that strength was measured by the size of a corporate balance sheet or the number of executives trembling in her boardroom. But looking at Garrett, a man who had faced down an explosive thermal runaway, an armored vehicle attack, and the weight of a national security lockdown without a single flicker of fear, she finally understood what true power looked like. It wasn't loud. It wasn't arrogant. It was a quiet, unshakable wall of masculinity dedicated entirely to the protection of those who were vulnerable. The transport touched down on the secure rooftop helipad of the Naval facility. The doors hissed open, and Captain Granger led the group down a heavily fortified corridor toward the primary operations theater. Waiting inside was Preston Brooks, the global chief executive of Vanguard Jet Services. He had flown in via emergency transport the moment the regional blackout lifted. Alongside him were dozens of military analysts and high-ranking defense officials, their faces pale as they stared at a massive, holographic map of the United States defense grid, which was currently blinking in a frozen, deadlocked crimson. When Garrett walked into the room, a collective hush fell over the entire command center. The operators in uniform instinctively stood at attention, their eyes widening as they recognized the legendary tactical architect who had vanished into obscurity a decade ago. Chief Petty Officer Vance, a 3-star admiral, announced from a secure, high-definition satellite feed on the main wall. The encryption feedback loop has paralyzed our entire Atlantic response capability. The Phantom Override module installed by Julian Cole has locked our command servers. We are blind, sir. We need the master decryption key. Garrett gently transferred the sleeping Lily into Victoria's arms. Victoria held the little girl close, her movements natural and tender, a silent acknowledgement of the deep, unbreakable bond that had formed between their families in the fires of the afternoon. Garrett stepped up to the primary command console, his large, grease-stained hands hovering over the multi-million-dollar interface. He didn't hesitate. He began inputting a long, complex sequence of algorithmic overrides, his calloused fingers moving with the rhythmic, flawless precision of a master musician. He wasn't relying on a modern software manual. He was executing the secret, unwritten protocols he had burned into the framework of the nation's defense grid before he walked away to become a father. With a final definitive stroke on the master keyboard, Garrett engaged the bypass. The massive holographic map violently shuddered. The frozen crimson lights fractured, dissolving into a brilliant, cascading wave of vibrant operational green. Across the room, communications arrays erupted with clear, unjammed signals as fleets across the hemisphere reported total system restoration. The digital chokehold was entirely broken. Justice had been delivered to the network, and the national security mission was saved. A deafening cheer erupted from the tech officers and analysts in the room. The admiral on the screen saluted sharply, his face filled with immense, profound relief. Chief Petty Officer Vance, the United States Navy owes you a debt that cannot be repaid. Your country is ready to reinstate your full laboratory commission at the Pentagon tomorrow. Name your terms. Garrett slowly stepped away from the flashing green monitors. He looked at the high-ranking officials, then at the regional executive Preston Brooks, who was trembling as he stepped forward with a blank corporate contract in his hand. Mr. Vance, please, Preston Brooks stammered, his voice desperate. Vanguard Jet Services will offer you millions. We will give you absolute control over the Austin terminal. Chad Montgomery has been stripped of his credentials and faces federal treason charges alongside Julian Cole. We will pay you whatever you want to repair our reputation. Garrett looked down at his oil-stained canvas sleeve, his face a steady, immovable mass of quiet dignity. My value was the same when I was holding a wrench this morning, Mr. Brooks, Garrett said, his deep baritone echoing with absolute finality. You didn't care about safety or expertise until your metrics threatened your lives. I don't sell my time to people who trade integrity for speed. My commission is done. I am going home to my daughter. Before Preston Brooks could plead any further, Victoria Sterling stepped forward. Her voice returned with a sudden, magnificent authority that completely dominated the military theater, but it was no longer cold. It was fierce, protective, and ringing with absolute respect. Vanguard's corporate lease on my private terminal is terminated effective immediately, Mr. Brooks, Victoria announced, her aristocratic eyes flashing with an unyielding steel. Sterling Global Aerospace is pulling all funding from your facilities. Furthermore, I am restructuring my entire global engineering division. She turned her gaze to Garrett, her expression softening into a look of deep, unconditional admiration. The emotional chemistry between them was palpable, a silent promise born from a shared nightmare. Garrett Vance is not your employee, and he will never be a subordinate in a corporate spreadsheet again. I am establishing an independent oversight board for global aviation safety. Garrett will hold the title of Supreme Technical Director with absolute, unconditional veto power over every aircraft, every factory, and every defense contract bearing the Sterling name. He answers to no one, and his contract will mandate exactly 40 hours of mandatory family leave every single week. The room fell into a stunned, respectful silence. The crowd of mechanics, soldiers, and corporate elites looked at the humble single father with unbridled awe. The man who had been discarded and humiliated just hours ago was now the most powerful safety authority in the international aerospace industry. Garrett looked at Victoria, seeing the rare, genuine warmth in her eyes, and a slow, beautiful smile finally broke through his rugged features. He nodded once, a gesture of quiet acceptance. The following evening, the sun began to dip below the Austin skyline, casting a warm, golden amber glow over a quiet neighborhood park. The violent roar of helicopter turbines and the screaming sirens of the tarmac were replaced by the sweet, melodic sound of children's laughter. Lily and Leo were running through the lush green grass, chasing after a small, hand-carved wooden glider that Garrett had helped them balance. Garrett sat on a weathered wooden park bench, his heavy work boots resting in the grass. Sitting right beside him was Victoria. She wasn't wearing her tailored wool coats or her expensive diamond jewelry. She wore a simple denim jacket and flat canvas shoes, her hands resting peacefully in her lap. For the first time in years, the powerful billionaire looked completely relaxed. Her shoulders dropped, her face bathed in the serene light of the setting sun. "You gave my son his mother back, Garrett," Victoria whispered softly, her eyes tracking the children as Leo happily handed the wooden plane back to Lily. "I spent so long trying to conquer the world because I thought it was the only way to keep us safe. I forgot how to just breathe." Garrett looked at her, his quiet masculinity radiating an immense, comforting security that seemed to wrap around her like a blanket. "The world moves too fast, Victoria. People get so focused on the destination that they forget the airframe has to survive the trip. You don't need an empire to protect him. You just need to be his anchor." Victoria turned her head, her beautiful clear eyes locking onto his rugged, weathered face. She slowly reached out, her fingers gently sliding into Garrett's large, calloused hand, feeling the indelible strength and stability of a man who would never break under pressure. "I don't want to fly alone anymore, Garrett," she said quietly, her voice trembling with a rare, beautiful honesty. "I think my empire needs an anchor." Garrett closed his powerful fingers around hers, a silent, unbreakable vow passing between them in the twilight. The single father who had been underestimated by the world had finally found his redemption, not through wealth or medals, but through the enduring power of his dignity and the safe harbor he had built for the people he loved. If you believe stories like this deserve to be told, leave a comment and subscribe to Single Dad Stories. We tell the stories that shouldn't be forgotten.